Hi, everyone. This is Dave Warner with Small Town Life, part of the Studio 25 podcast network. And today we've got an author online, interesting author. He's written a book called Defending Fort Stanwix. And this is about, the August 1977 period in time. I'm sorry, 1977. Bill, I'm killing it here. 1777. I was in the wrong century. I'm okay by a couple. Yeah. Anyway, Fort Stanwix is located in Rome, New York. And this is, I've read quite a bit of this. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but I really got drawn into it. And it's a story of the New York frontier back in 1777 and what it was like back then and what it was like for some of the people that were involved in the battles around that time frame. So I thought it was really interesting because this battle at Fort Stanwix had a impact on the Saratoga campaign, which a lot of people say was a turning point in the Revolutionary War. So, Bill, Larry, going by Larry. Larry Kidder is the author of the book, and I thought it's really interesting. And welcome to the show, Larry.
Thank you very much, Dave.
So tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, who you are.
Well, I'm a retired high school history teacher. I taught for about 40 years, both in public and private schools. Graduate of Allegheny College. After college, I started teaching out near Cleveland, Ohio. Then I spent 4 years in the Navy, and then I came to New Jersey and have taught up until about when I retired in 2011. But I do a lot of stuff locally with historical societies and historic sites in the area, and have really continued being a teacher in retirement, both that way and through my writing. I consider my writing to be a continuation of my teaching.
Okay.
When I chose to be a high school teacher rather than go on and get a PhD and be a college teacher, mostly because I wanted to help kids learn to like history and to want to know more about history and that kind of thing. So in my writing, I don't try to, how shall I put it, just put out facts. I try to make it a human story and one that will make history interesting to people and want to learn more about it.
Yeah. I mean, what did you always want to be an author? I mean, you're teaching history, but was writing your thing too?
Well, I always have enjoyed writing in various ways. And in college is when I really decided to write books rather than articles or short things or manuals for this and that thing. And I had a teacher, professor in college named Jay Luvas, who was a military historian dealing with the Civil War primarily, although he did other things too. And he published books, obviously, as a college professor. And he kind of encouraged me along the way. And so it became my bucket list thing. I want to get a book published at some point. While I was teaching, all I could do was research and an outline and that kind of thing. I couldn't really get into the complete picture of writing a book. But as soon as I retired, I started writing and researching, continuing the research.
Is this your first book that you've had published, or have you had others prior to this?
This is, I think, number 9.
Oh, okay. So you've got a long list. Now,
some of those I self-published. They were about very local history here in New Jersey, and publishers said, well, it's too local an audience, for anything else. But then I had a literary agent come to one of my talks on one of the books that I published myself, and he offered to help me, as a literary agent. And then he also started his own publishing firm. And so he was my first publisher. And he still continues to be an agent for me. And it was really through him that I got connected with Cornell.
Yeah. So how many prior to this one then? Is this like the first really big one for you as far as publishing, or have you had a couple prior to that? What were the subject matter of the earlier ones?
Well, subject matter.
You knew I was going to ask that, right?
Yeah, I know, and I'm glad you did, because my other books are about New Jersey.
Okay. Oh, we don't care. Interview's over.
But a lot of important things in the Revolution happened in New Jersey. I live right in the area, just a few miles from the Battle of Trenton and from the Battle of Princeton. And I've really gotten involved with that. I wrote about 4 books that deal with Trenton during the Revolution, not just the day of the battle. Princeton, same thing, 10 years of its Revolutionary War history. I wrote a book on the militia of this section of New Jersey where I live, and then also on the 10 crucial days, the overview of Trenton and Princeton and whatnot. I love David Hackett Fisher's book on Washington's Crossing, and my book, 10 Crucial Days. Some people might look at that as, trying to, do something that's already been done. But as much as I like Fisher's book, he didn't do it the way I would do it. And I wanted to get in how the events fit into what was going on in a number of places in the colonies and in Britain, for that matter. And, again, a lot of personal stories, and to see the lack of communication at that time compared to today, and how long it took, and how things would impact, and that sort of thing. So when I write, as I tell people, I write books and I research books that I wish somebody else had done. I don't do it to say, okay, I got to defend this, I've got to prove this.
Right.
I write to understand something, not to prove something. And that's why I'm a little bit different.
And there is a connection between the battle at Fort Stanwix and New Jersey, correct?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like you just said, oh, let me go, to another state and write about something that I have no connection to. Well,
my real connection to Fort Stanwix is I had an ancestor in the garrison in the 3rd New York Continental Line. And I've always wanted to know what happened in his life, what he experienced. And so the book is not about him, specifically, although he makes an appearance, here and there. But it's definitely to understand his world, if you will, to understand what he went through. My ancestor is one of those really weird Rev War veterans who lived to be in his late 90s, but who never submitted a pension application. So he never told his story, to the officials. Anybody who knows the pension applications knows that you can get some really cool stories from them. But he didn't do that. And he didn't write any memoirs. He didn't write a lot of letters. So really all I could do was find out about his world, and find out what he went through.
Well, it was, you said earlier, one of the things I want to go back to was my sense when I was reading it was something you touched on for a second about the communication portion. We are so used to this instantaneous communication that we have today. And one of the things I had 2 thoughts as I was reading through the book is, one, I need a map up here to kind of visualize the points on the map we're talking about. Because, up here we're talking about German Flats, and we're talking Albany and Schenectady, and we're talking, Oriskany, which was Oriska at the time, and all of these things. And I was like, I need to put pins on there. And then the other thing, I several times I had to keep reading through, because I was like, the way they had to communicate, and sometimes you had parallel communications going simultaneously that one person didn't know what the other wrote, and they're crossing each other on the way with couriers. And it's really hard to imagine that these days, and to put yourself into that position and how difficult it was, even for someone to make a decision to send troops somewhere before they even get the permission to do so.
Sure. No, we just have to get over thinking that they had the same advantages for communication that we have today. Just have to. And it's, I can't even imagine myself trying to make decisions based on the partial evidence and the conflicting evidence and everything like that they had to go through.
Yeah. The other thing is conditions. I mean, we're so spoiled. Go home to a house that has heat, it has air conditioning, and
Yeah,
here were troops marching through the woods, taking a long time to get from point A to B. And then when
right.
they get there, no real place to cover yourself. Yes, they brought tents, but Fort Stanwix was in a decline period. It wasn't totally dismantled, but it was definitely in poor shape. And I just can't imagine getting there and going, okay, where do we sleep? Where do we eat? Where do we do anything?
Yeah, yeah. The condition of the fort is one of the things that I found really interesting. The fact that they've been attempting to restore it to full capacity for a long time, but because of the issues that they were dealing with and the lack of manpower that they had, they never could get it done. And one of my favorite quotes in the book is from a young man who was from the general area. He was a local guy in the Continental Line, and he just said when they got there, "My gosh, this isn't ready for us. We're going to be working.
Yeah.
We know what we're going to be doing here.
But
It's going to be shovels and picks and axes and all of that." And even as the siege began in the first couple of days of August, they were still putting on, and during the siege, they were still doing reconstruction.
Yeah.
And then after the siege, they were doing reconstruction.
Well, the assumption was by, I get upper level, maybe even up to General Washington, that it had been destroyed. It had been dismantled, correct? But yet when
that was the word, yeah.
Right.
It had been destroyed. It had really just been left to decline on its own.
Right.
And of course, being wood and mud and that kind of thing, it's going to deteriorate. But it's a point. Not only did our generals think of it as being done, being destroyed. St. Ledger felt it had been pretty much destroyed, and there were hardly any troops there.
Yeah.
I mean, much of I don't want to take anything away from the Continental soldiers who defended the fort, but so much of the reason St. Ledger was not successful was his lack of being prepared for even a dilapidated fort that he ran into.
Right, because he also believed those stories about the condition of the fort.
Yeah, and even when he captured some of the 3rd New York out on a mission to collect sod to pack the fort with, and he had interviewed several of those captives, and they told him really how good it was, compared to what he thought. I mean, they weren't necessarily saying anything great about it, but it still seemed he just didn't believe it.
He didn't believe it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was amazing. The other interesting thing, the way you get into the book, you talk a lot about how there were all these different groups of people, not just white settlers, but indigenous people and just all the different countries involved. Yeah. And how, we think today we're very fractured, we're very tribal. But yet, if you look back at how you're describing how people treated each other, how they thought of each other, how they interacted, how they just operated, it's not very much different, to be honest.
Oh, it was extremely diverse, and you had people in every portion of the diversity who were, shall we say, good to each other, thinking positively, and others who were on the negative side. But I think it's really important to recognize how much of a civil war the revolution in general was, but particularly, and I'm speaking as an outsider here, but the Mohawk Valley was really in a civil war, as was New Jersey in many ways. And that really isn't something that people, I know when I was going through school and learning about the Saratoga campaign, the siege at Fort Stanwix was the British against the American Continental Army.
Yep.
It wasn't the diversity. It wasn't the Native American. It wasn't the Loyalists. It wasn't, whole different brothers were fighting brothers at the siege.
Right. And it was, and that was the thing that jumped out at me too, was that the way you remarked it was more like a civil war, because even forget the white settlers, you had the indigenous tribes, and you had multiple tribes, and they weren't, some of them didn't know which side to pick. Some of them were against each other. It was just this mishmash of complexity. When you add in the fact that they couldn't communicate really quickly, language barriers aside, just I'm thinking, how in the world did any of this work?
Yeah.
So walk me through, in not a rapid session, but kind of the events, what you think are the important events that led up to the battle there, and then what you think the impact was overall on the American Revolution.
Okay. I think leading up to the siege, the important thing, and one thing that I really tried to do, was to give the reader an idea of how the Continental Army was developing, and who were going to be the garrison in terms of what was their experience, what was the quality of the troops, how many troops were there, things like that. How familiar were they with the territory, all of those kind of things. Because I think a lot of people, I know it's always been presented to me this way too. The Continental Army is the Continental Army at its peak. Now, early in the war, it wasn't at its peak. The Continental Army was not like the U.S. Army or the U.S. Navy, which I'm familiar with today, where it's a very structured organization where everybody knows or can find out quickly what to do. And, it just wasn't that way. A lot of, they were still recruiting troops into the Third Continental right up to, and then again, even after the siege, because the regiment wasn't complete yet.
Yeah, the interesting thing was that they were only signing them up for 1-year tours, and they typically, a lot of them deserted basically in the wintertime, right? And that's when they were recruiting again to fill.
Well, that's one thing that I wanted to show, Dave, is that the first two military units to occupy the fort, the 3rd New Jersey and then the Connecticut Regiment, those were 1-year enlistments. They're what I refer to, and many refer to, as the second establishment of the Continental Army. The first establishment being the militia and that kind of thing that Washington picked up in Massachusetts after the battles of Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, and that. The 3rd New York was different in that it was for the third establishment, the establishment that would replace those 1-year troops from the second establishment. So it was a brand new regiment. Okay. The whole regiment hadn't even been together for training or anything like that until several groups at different times came to Fort Stanwix, and then they were finally united. And that was just shortly before the siege began. Yeah. So these guys hadn't even worked as a regiment cohesively, if you will, before the siege. Most of the guys that are in the 3rd New York are going to serve for at least 3 years, if not the full war. My ancestor, for example, served through the rest of the war. He served 6.5 years. And the first real combat experience he had was Fort Stanwix. He had a lot of combat experience after that, but he was not a real veteran, if you will, of combat until after Fort Stanwix. And a lot of the guys were in that same situation. So that makes it even more incredible in a way that they survived out there without the communication. They didn't even know what each other was doing half the time. And it was tough.
Talk me through the battle itself. I mean, how,
Yeah.
How many troops were there defending? How many approached? Kind of how the battle went, or you call it a siege? Let's call it a siege.
Yeah. Numbers of troops are difficult to come down to anything near exact. You can get ballpark figures and that sort of thing, but again, we've talked about communication. A lot of these they didn't even know what they had.
Yeah.
But the Third New York was probably around 400 or 500. There was another 100 from a Massachusetts regiment that had been down at German Flats at Fort Dayton, and sent a company up to Fort Stanwix. There were a few militia guys, and there were a number of Oneida Indians there, but not really in what do you say formations, and it was more individual helping out. So it was, not that many, several hundred. St. Ledger theoretically brought down over 1,000, but again, depending on who you read and all of that, you can't tell, because he had Native Americans fighting for him also. We're talking about Civil War, the Oneidas were helping Fort Stanwix, the Mohawks and Senecas and others from the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee Confederation were siding with the British. And just how many of them came is conflicted.
Hard to tell.
Even the Hessians, the Jaegers, the light infantry that came with St. Ledger, you get different numbers. There were supposed to be so many, but then, well, we don't think all of them actually came or actually went, that sort of thing.
Right.
And then there were the Loyalists, John Johnson's New York Loyalist Regiment. Again, this is where it gets into Civil War. Again, the numbers were changing all the time, so it's really hard to tell.
Wasn't Johnson the one that is he the one they captured and basically got a promise from him not to participate anymore and sent him home? Who was that?
Johnson.
I don't know.
Johnson.
I don't know if it was him or somebody else. I just found it amazing that
John Johnson he was a well-known loyalist,
right?
Son of a very well-known person, William Johnson, and he had sort of indicated that he'd be a good boy,
yeah.
and not really get into action and all. But that was, in some ways, I think, a delaying tactic on his part, because he wanted to get even more guys from his neighborhood to join up, and they did. And the 3rd New Jersey actually came to Fort Stanwix in order to get John Johnson and the Loyalists out of German Flats at that time, or excuse me, Johnstown at that time. And John Johnston departed, got the word, got out of there and took his forces with him. And that's when they formed that Loyalist regiment up in Canada that later is going to come down and besiege Fort Stanwix.
Right. So anyway, talk me through
that. I think that's who you mean when you say
I was thinking
he sort of got chased out.
Yeah, I mean, I thought was interesting was the fact that there were people that say went out scouting and they got captured. And
yes,
they would tell them, okay, we've got you, and if we release you, you have to promise not to do anything. I just thought that was amazing. And then okay, I'll go home now.
They particularly did that with officers.
Yeah.
There was a real gap between officers and enlisted at that time as a social system.
Right.
And officers were gentlemen, and their word could be trusted because they were gentlemen.
Yeah.
The common soldier, not so much, although you do hear about them paroling common soldiers every once in a while, but mostly it was officers.
Yeah.
One thing that, you're kind of almost leading me into there, I thought you were going to say, a number of the deserters from Fort Stanwix actually joined the British force.
Yeah, that was an interesting point because that was right when they heard about the Declaration of Independence, correct? And
Yeah.
the fact that it actually turned some the other way.
Well, they had heard about the Declaration of Independence, you know, back in 1776.
Right, but what
Not
was it that they
1777.
what was it that was declared at that time that caused them to? Wasn't there a document or something that happened? No.
I'm not sure what you're
Okay.
thinking about,
I don't know.
but I
I
do.
might have I might have
It's
misread that.
absolutely true. It's
Yeah.
absolutely true. The Declaration of Independence caused a number of patriots to change sides
Well, that's
because
I read that in there. I
instead of
get somewhere. Yeah.
instead of protesting the need to have equal rights with British citizens living in Britain, it now became a war for independence. Now they're traitors. They're not loyal subjects fighting for their rights and to keep their country strong. Now they're trying to break away. And a lot of patriots couldn't deal with that and went over to the loyalists. Yeah.
That's what I was getting at, was that aspect. I don't think we,
Now that happened for one of the groups early on,
right.
One of the earlier garrisons, not the time of the siege.
Okay. Well, I told you I was having trouble following it.
Yeah.
I just thought it was interesting that document would have that impact on people, where you would, as we sit here, hundreds of years later, we'd be sitting here thinking, oh, wow, that would just fire everybody up. Well, yeah, it did, but in two different directions.
In different ways, yeah.
I just found that fascinating. So the siege, all right, here they come.
Yeah. Okay. So right around August 1st and 2nd, St. Leger's forces finally get there. They've had a long trip down from Montreal through the rivers and lakes and whatnot. And they finally get there, and the first contact really is with Oneida's scouts that were outside the fort looking for the enemy that they suspected was coming. And they ran into them and were chased back into the fort and all. But it was definitely the Oneidas that were the first contact of the garrison. And then St. Leger surrounds the fort, obviously, and finally gets his artillery, small as it was, scarce as it was, and starts going in. But he actually wanted to try to get the fort to surrender. You guys, you got this lousy fort. You've got, you're way out in the wilderness here. Who's going to help you? You might as well surrender. And of course, he could point back to the French and Indian War and the massacre at Fort William Henry, when the troops did not surrender until later on, and then got massacred. So they kind of threatened, St. Leger kind of threatened them with that. But Colonel Gansevoort and Lieutenant Colonel Willett did not want to do that. So they refused that. And it was not too long after that, or around that time, that the militia from down the German Flats area and other places in the Mohawk Valley under Herkimer, went up and essentially were trying to relieve the fort and help the fort out when the Battle of Oriskany occurred. And that was, a lot of Oneidas helped out with that. That was both militia and Oneidas. And while that battle was going on, Lieutenant Colonel Willett at Fort Stanwix led a sortie outside of about 250 men, theoretically to go help Herkimer, but they never got that far because they found that so many of St. Leger's Indians and troops had gone down to fight that battle that they had left their camps relatively unguarded. And so Willett went after those camps and got hold of a lot of stuff. And the troops that St. Leger had left behind did try to get together and oppose Willett, but it wasn't successful. And so Willett got back to the fort. Um, Again, St. Ledger is going to try to get them to surrender, get the Americans to surrender. And again, they're going to refuse. So now it's about August 7th or so, and things just kind of form a continuous pattern of artillery attacks on the fort from a distance, some sniper attacks from outside. There's never a frontal assault of the St. Ledger trying to, scale the walls of the fort and capture it. His Native Americans were much brighter than the white guys. Particularly, they believed in living to fight another day.
Yeah.
Definitely want to win. I'm not taking anything away from them that way. But I guess partly because of their experience with disease and everything else with the white man, they knew that they didn't have the numbers. They couldn't replace a lot of casualties. They'd been replacing casualties with captives, in their culture for a long time. And so they had that issue. But anyway, the siege just goes back and forth. Guys are picked off, guys get hit by shell fire, things like that. Nothing, quote unquote, nothing serious in terms of a major battle, but a lot of nitpicking and making life miserable for the guys in the fort. And of course, the longer the siege lasts, the more St. Ledger's troops are suffering also from being so far from any of their support. And the Native American troops that they have want to get out of there.
Yeah, they wanted it over quick and fast, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so it's ultimately going to end after about 21, 22 days, when the troops that are forming up near Saratoga are going to send General Arnold back to Fort Stanwix with some relief. And Arnold sends a local man who's a little different, but very, very much respected by the Indians. And very well known to people. And since Arnold had captured him and threatened to hang him and all as a loyalist and whatnot, they tell Han-Yost Schuyler to go out to Fort Stanwix and tell not tell Fort Stanwix, but tell the troops attacking Fort Stanwix that a huge number of replacements and reinforcements are on the way. And the natives in St. Ledger's troops are ready to go anyway. And St. Ledger is looking and saying, well, I can't deal with that. So he orders his troops to withdraw also. And that's about August 22nd or so.
Right. And so what was the impact on the Battle of Saratoga from what happened at Stanwix?
Well, it meant that one of the three forces trying to gather from three different directions on the Albany area isn't going to get there. St. Ledger's going to try to get there. He's going to retreat back down the Mohawk Valley, or not the Mohawk Valley, but the other side of, up to Lake Oneida and then to Lake Ontario and all that, and try to get around and come down and help Burgoyne. But he's not going to get there in time. So
was it because
one group of troops, and also St. Ledger's force was supposed to draw off some of the American troops,
right,
that were heading,
and that didn't happen, right?
That didn't happen. Yeah. That didn't happen. So it had the effect that way.
Right. And do you think the amount of time St. Ledger spent at Fort Stanwix and then having to go the long route back down towards Albany made it that he was never going to be engaged in that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
That's awesome.
And of course, Howe never came up from New York either to be the third part. So it was just Burgoyne.
Right.
who had to fight the battle.
It's amazing just to get into that kind of detail, read the book, and just these personal stories. And like I said earlier, the overreaching kind of civil war that was going on at that time. We think of the Civil War as there only being the one. But not when you read that. You don't think of it that way. I don't think it was ever presented in history as that the American Revolution was a civil war at the same time kind of approach.
Now, that's one reason I wanted to become a high school history teacher, because I knew it was not being portrayed very well, very accurately.
Right. So anything else that you want to mention about the book that we haven't covered, kind of thing?
Just again, that I hope it doesn't have too many themes. I hope it, holds together well, but just the complexity of what was going on at that time, and how that affected people who were not even associated with the military, except they might have had a husband or a father or something like that, and just how personal war is. It's not units fighting each other.
Right.
It's not pieces on a war game board. It's human beings that are having to deal with all kinds of issues.
Yeah.
One of my favorite stories is, there were women at the fort. There were wives of some of the soldiers, for example. And one of those wives was wounded. She stayed at the fort, even though Gansevoort had sent most of the women and children away. She stayed at the fort, and she was wounded by an artillery shell the night before the fort surrendered. She took a piece of a shell in her butt. Okay, it was a fairly significant wound. But then she gave birth the next day.
Wow.
The day the siege ended. Both mother and daughter did fine. Okay, but that to me just is a perfect example of the personal things that you don't ever really associate with warfare.
Right. And I think for people up in this area, central New York area, the fact that you're talking about places that we drive through every day, that now when I go through German Flats or something, or now I'm like, I have been to Fort Stanwix before, but it's been, I don't even remember when I was there. Now I'm like, I want to go back there and kind of link it to what I've been reading and what you wrote kind of thing, and think about it. And, just the whole area, hearing about it, it was amazing to read it. So where can we find the book, Larry?
Well, you can find it where you guys are. The best place to go would be Fort Plain.
Okay. Is it in the Fort Plain Library?
Yeah.
Ah, awesome.
Now, it's not released yet. It won't be released until November 15th.
Okay. But
I know that Brian Mack, I'm at Fort Plain.
The name's familiar, yes.
Okay. Anyway, he can take pre-orders for it. And it can be pre-ordered online, from Amazon or from just about anywhere. But I like to help Fort Plain. And them selling books, they get the profit from it. So that's good. I'm going to be giving a talk, by the way, for Fort Plain at Johnstown at the college.
Okay.
Fulmer Montgomery College there.
When are you going to do that?
That's going to be the 16th
of November.
Saturday, the 16th of November.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that open to the public, or?
Yes, I would have people go to the Fort Plain website, and it'll have the information about it there.
All right. I will find that and put it up there. Well, Larry, I really appreciate your time today. It's an interesting read. I am going to finish it. I'm going to work hard at it. But I think that if anybody has any interest in, being up here and connecting the dots between the places, we have Gansevoort Street here in Little Falls, and as soon as you see that name, it's like, what's the connection? Or you drive through German Flats, like I said, or different places that you've mentioned in the book, you get a connection to what it was like, 250 years ago, what was happening, kind of thing. So really interesting read. I really appreciate it.
Good. I'm glad. I'm really hopeful that, like you, people living in that area will find it really interesting and not just repetitious of things they already know. But I tell you, I live in New Jersey. I've never lived in the Mohawk Valley, but I tell you, I've been visiting up there, Fort Plain, Fort Stanwix, etc. And I really love the area up there.
Yeah,
And
it's beautiful up here.
I hope this book, really contributes to everybody's enjoyment of living there and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Larry. And that's all we have today, everyone. This has been Dave Warner with Small Town Life. We'll see you next time.